So Airborne Imaging, we're a geospatial services company. We're focused on LiDAR acquisition. We also acquire aerial photography um, and hyperspectral. We also do methane leak detection. We were founded in 2004 as an employee-owned company, and we were purchased by Bar Geospatial in 2022. We have offices in Houston, Mesquite, and Calgary. We do LiDAR and acquisition surveys for all levels of government, federal, municipal, and also provincial. We do work for agencies such as FEMA, USGS in the States, conservation authorities here in Ontario. We do work for utility companies, so distribution and transmission corridors. We do vegetation management. Forestry consultants and landowners, also engineering companies for transportation, rail, flood mapping projects, and urban development, exploration and mining companies. We work for consultants working in exploration and mining, and also juniors and majors, so through all stages of the exploration process. We also have clients in the renewable energy sector, wind and solar projects, and then other geospatial companies. So providers who don't have their own sensors or maybe only have one sensor, because we are the largest LiDAR mapping company in terms of internal capacity. We have 12 airborne sensors flying with fixed wing across North America, and so that's how we can help some of the other geospatial companies. We also use UAVs or UASs for projects that are too small to send one of our planes. We'll receive a calibrated point cloud from the provider, and we do all the processing ourselves so that we're always delivering a consistent product to our clients. So over to the LiDAR guidelines. So Natural Resources Canada first formally created the LiDAR guidelines in 2017. The document was created in consultation with several Canadian LiDAR companies and the creator of the USGS LiDAR Base Specification, Carl Heidman. The document was most recently updated in 2022 to version 3.1. And I hear from folks at NRCan that this version 3.1 is actually under review and an update is forthcoming. The federal guideline describes the Canadian Quality Level 1, so CQL1, and the requirements for the airborne LiDAR data support the Government of Canada's National Elevation Data Strategy. And we receive an update of that document about annually. So it tells us where the government is in terms of their large LiDAR acquisition projects and what some of their plans are for the future. So the strategy has created specs for LiDAR data that has helped stakeholders participate in delivering products that are consistent and standardized across the country. What I really like about the document is there are 6 appendices at the very end. And you can see on the slide here, the appendices at the bottom. So they provide very specific guidelines for LiDAR collection for forestry projects, for flood mapping, for high relief terrain, urban infrastructure mapping, and airborne topobathy work. And they also have a really great suggestion for if you're putting out an RFP or writing a contract, what they suggest should be included. And so by following the specs in this document, you can be sure that your LiDAR data that you're procuring will meet a standard. The USGS specification describes LiDAR data based on 4 quality levels. So QL for quality level 0, 1, 2, and 3. And these specifications are used for the National Interagency 3D Elevation Program, or 3DEP, that you might have heard of. So stakeholders from all levels of government and private companies were consulted in the development of this specification and also in ongoing updates. So the first portion of this document is actually an extensive overview of updates that have come up every couple of years as folks are actually using the data and they receive feedback on what's working and what's not working, and then the document is updated to reflect this. So for the purposes of our discussion here this morning, I'm going to be reviewing the most used specifications in our experience on the Canadian side, the high flood risk category, and on the USGS side, QL0. The high flood risk mapping on the Canadian side specifies 4 to 10 points per square meter. The USGS QL0 is 8 points per square meter, aggregate nominal pulse spacing of 35 centimeters, NVA or non-vegetated vertical accuracy 5 centimeter, and NVA at 95% of 9.8 centimeters for QL0 and 10 centimeters to 15 centimeters for the federal spec. The horizontal datum for both specifications in Canada is NAT83 CSRS. The epoch is going to be dependent on the region or the province. So in Ontario, it's 2010. The vertical datum is CGVD 2013 in Canada for both specifications. Obviously, USGS will be different in the US. So to note, if you're a municipality who's putting out an RFP, your historic mapping is probably going to be in CGVD 28. So if you receive data in the new meeting, the Federal Airborne LiDAR Guidelines, the data is not going to line up when it's overlaid because of the two different datums. So we found that some of our clients are requesting delivery in both datums, CGVD 2013 and CGVD 28. The investment isn't cost prohibitive depending on the overall budget. And certainly for flood mapping projects that municipalities or conservation authorities have coming out, data that's able to be easily overlaid is very important. So just a description of the difference between the aggregate nominal pulse spacing and aggregate nominal point density is the pulse spacing is the distance between the points, and the density is the number of points per square kilometer. We have in the past seen some RFPs where that terminology has been mixed up, and of course has led to a lot of questions back and forth to help the procurers sort out what exactly they're looking for. So this is an important difference to note. So the federal guideline has more acquisition recommendations than the USGS specification. Both documents require a 100-meter buffer to be added to the project area as part of the flight planning. The federal guideline requires a minimum swath overlap of 15%, but it also includes higher overlap recommendations based on the use of data. For example, a 50% minimum overlap for urban mapping and also forestry. The federal guideline also recommends a best practice scan angle of between plus or minus 20 to 20 degrees field of view. And the USGS years ago removed a recommendation for overlap and scan angles. So it's up to the user or the procurer to define what they would like for the overlap and the scan angle. Cross tie lines. So those are flight lines acquired perpendicular to the planned data acquisition flight lines. So I have two examples here for two projects. The one on the left is a Saint Laurent project for Natural Resources Canada, NRCan, and the project on the right is a QL0 project that we acquired for South Nation Conservation Authority and partners. So it was a group of Conservation Authority partners and MNRF. So these are the flight lines, and you can see that we have the perpendicular flight lines through each of the acquisition areas. So the cross tie lines provide data to support the accuracy validation, and they can also be used to support the adjustment of the data if there are periods of unexpected poor PDOP. The USGS doesn't require cross tie lines. The federal guideline recommends cross ties. So as a rule, we always fly the cross ties when we're flying a project for QL0 or federal guideline. So the USGS does not stipulate base station use. On the Federal Airborne LiDAR Guideline, a single base station for correcting the GNSS signals should be between 25 to 35 kilometers in the field of collection, depending on the size and the configuration of the project area. Two or more base stations are are recommended with baselines within that distance. What has been evolving over the last years is that PPP, or precise point positioning, has become the standard. So rather than triangulate between the base station on the ground, the GPS in the sensor, and the satellite, PPP is a positioning technique that removes and models the GNSS errors. So here is where I am, and this is the time that I'm broadcasting my location, about every 24 hours calculated from the global network. Using PPP can reduce the cost of the survey because we don't have to establish base stations and have them running during acquisition. Also, in urban areas, establishing base stations, we've actually heard of vendors where the base stations have been stolen in the field. And so that's a cost that vendors need to keep in mind. So using PPP reduces the chances of your base station being stolen, human error. It increases the productivity, and it's also safer. So for remote projects, there's no human travel, no helicopters, and that sort of thing. So last year in 2023, the ASPRS, so we're going to talk about LiDAR validation now. So the ASPRS removed the pass or fail requirement for VVA, or vegetated vertical accuracy, for LiDAR. This is because data producers and data users had reported that we're challenged in situations where the NVA checkpoint is well within the contract specifications, but the VVA is not. Obviously, because we're dealing with ground cover at different levels, the vegetation at different levels, and the factors that are affecting that vegetated vertical accuracy, they're not a function of the LiDAR accuracy system, the LiDAR system accuracy. It's a function of the ground cover. So now, per ASPRS specifications, only NVA should be used when making a pass or fail decision on the overall project. VVA should be evaluated and reported, but it shouldn't be used as a criterion for acceptance. So that's a new change that happened this past summer. So these are the new requirements now. You can see at the bottom, table C1 are the previous requirements, where we had the list of the number of checkpoints for NVA and VVA, and also the project area in square kilometers. And up at the top, you can see the new requirements. And they've also expanded the ranges in terms of project size per square kilometer. So now let's move on to hydro-flattening. So hydro-flattening is the process of modifying the LiDAR-derived DEM so that hydrographic features such as streams, rivers, and water bodies are flat and level from bank to bank. You can see the difference here. This is courtesy of an image from 4DM, that the non-hydro-flattened surface has these triangulated areas across the water, because when the laser sensor comes down from the aircraft, it doesn't know whether or not it's hitting the same level on either side of the water body at the bank. And so the treatment is given to streams and rivers that are at least 30 meters wide, or water bodies that are 0.8 hectares. So if you visualize what is 0.8 hectares, that's a pond that's about 100 meters in diameter. So we create break lines along the hydrographic features that meet that minimum requirement for inclusion. And then the break lines are used to create the tin, and then the new DEM is created. So both documents are requiring that a hydro-flattened DEM be delivered. Not to be confused with hydro enforcement and hydro conditioning. We often get clients confusing the three terms. Hydro enforcement ensures that water flows downstream in the DEM for purposes of modeling the flow of the water. So without hydro enforcement, the downslope flow will be dammed by the raised topography. And then a hydro conditioned is the processing of the DEM or tin, so the flow of water is continuous across the entire terrain surface. so there aren't any sinks or pits in the DEM. So just be careful when you're using that terminology: hydro-enforcing, hydro-conditioning, and hydro-flattening. So in terms of the project deliverables, the classification of the point cloud is basically the same for both the federal guidelines and the USGS specifications. The only difference is the USGS adds 21, code 21 for snow if it's present and identifiable, and 22 for temporal exclusion, typically in intertidal zones. But otherwise, both guidelines include process but uncalibrated, ground or bare earth, low and high noise, water and bridge deck, and also ignored ground. Each document also specifies what reporting should be included. I find the federal guideline a bit easier to follow. They break down all of the reports in one table, so it's very easy for our folks to pull out the information that's required for the reporting. So where did this all take us? So I just want to talk a little bit about the National Disaster Mitigation Program. And so when these RFPs first started coming out in 2015, there was over $20 million, by the way, over 5 years, so 2015 to 2020, for the NDMP program. In 2020, there was a renewal, an additional $25 million from 2020 to 2021, and then another $5 million at the end of 2021. An additional 20 million, this is a lot of millions, 20 million in April of 2021 to March 2022. And so this program addressed the rising flood risks. I'm sure a lot of folks remember a lot of these massive flood events, 100-year floods that were happening all over the country. And there was data that there was not good data available. So we were looking at 10-meter DEMs in areas where which don't measure the flooding at all. And so the NDMP program addressed the rising flood risks and the associated costs, and it started to build the foundation for informed mitigation investments that could reduce or even negate the effects of these massive flood events that were happening across the country. Then the flood hazard identification and mapping program started in 2021 with $63.8 million and now up to $227 million. Maps and data are cost shared 50-50 between the federal government and the province, or 75-25 between the federal government and the territories. The flood maps created under the FHMP program must meet the federal flood mapping guidelines, and the funds can be used for data acquisition. So that's the flood mapping meeting the federal guidelines. And then also flood hazard assessment and dissemination of flood hazard information. Projects are listed on the FHMP website. So if you go to the website, you can see the projects that are listed, and it tells you if data is currently in acquisition or if the project is completed or where they are in the stage of these different categories. So this FHMP program has been, both NDMP and FHMP have been amazing for getting LiDAR data into the hands of stakeholders who might not have been able to afford the investment on their own. So why use a guideline or a specification? So both documents allow the users to receive LiDAR data that meets a variety of needs, and they're both updated on a regular basis following real-world project results. The removal of VVA as an acceptance criteria is a great example. The key benefit of following a guideline or a specification is that users don't have to guess what to request from vendors. And so we found if we're approached by an engineering company to do a LiDAR survey, we will always follow the federal Airborne LiDAR Guidelines. Because if that data down the line, let's say the client of that engineering company, the engineering company doesn't want to share with us who their end client is, and it turns out that it's a municipality or an exploration and mining company who then wants to submit their project for approval, and the end approvers are asking, well, what spec does this data meet? And it doesn't meet a spec, then they always come back to us. And so we now always follow either QL0, or sorry, either USGS QL level or the federal Airborne LiDAR guideline, so that our data always meets a specification. And that way, our clients are always assured that the data is meeting a standard. The decision about which spec to follow should depend on the final use of the data. And again, that's why I love the federal guideline, because at the end we have those appendices advising what some of the criterion that should be used is. And so I'll now open up the floor to questions. I know we just have a few minutes here.
Susan, that was great.
Thank you very much.
Very, very nicely done. And I know these documents can be a bit daunting to people, especially if they don't have a statistics background. You know, what is RMSE and things like that. So I really appreciate you summarizing that. And just on a personal note, I was impressed with you know, the breadth of number of sensors you folks have, and I made a note about your 8 twin Navajos. In our world, we really had trouble last year securing an aircraft and pilots. Are you finding that pilots are becoming, I don't want to say rare, but harder to come by post-COVID and things like that? Can you comment about the operational side?
Yeah, so we are part of the BAR geospatial family, and so BAR Air Patrol is our U.S. sister who does pipeline air patrols, and they actually have over 50 aircraft flying doing pipeline patrols, and so they look after that the procurement of good pilots. But
Okay.
certainly there is a turnaround factor. These are small planes, and so once the pilot gets their hours in, they want to go fly for the big guys.
Yeah.
So that's definitely a challenge that we have. On the Canadian side, we have our own aircraft, and then we also have long-term leases. And so that helps us fill our need for aircraft and pilots. We have companies that we use that will supply aircraft and pilots if our own planes aren't available. But it's definitely a revolving door for these pilots. You know, I
Mm.
don't blame, Piper Navajo versus, an Airbus, what have you.
Yeah. Yeah.
If I'm a pilot, yeah, I'm looking for the big one. So, yeah.
That's right, and I'm sure you would agree. You know, nothing beats an experienced survey pilot who can come in online, keep
Exactly.
your overlap correct, and so forth.
Yeah, and some of the conditions that we fly are so challenging. We've got to, sometimes we have to do terrain following if we're in those really mountainous areas, especially, in Quebec and some places in northern Quebec and sorry, in BC and northern Quebec and northern Ontario. There's some really challenging flying, Arctic flying, that sort of thing. So yeah, experience is definitely, um, very
Great.
important to have.
Great. I see there's a couple of questions here. One from Reed McLean asking, can you comment on the capacity of Canadian companies to supply LiDAR services considering the requirements for LiDAR and topobathy LiDAR in the federal FHMP program, the flood program you mentioned, projects?
Yeah, there certainly is capacity. And in fact, when I started off in LiDAR for airborne imaging 13 years ago, we didn't have a lot of competition, and also the point densities were so low. But now there's a lot of competition. Natural Resources Canada actually a few years ago created a qualified vendor list, and so every few years they'll put out this document. A request for, I forget if they call it a
Standing
request for
offer,
service.
perhaps?
That's right, the standing offer. And so companies can submit their information and get onto their approved list. And so for ANOCAN projects, they have a great pool of suppliers. So in Canada, there's a lot of competition now. And I think even some of the US companies are now coming up and acquiring data for meeting the Canadian needs. So there's
Great.
no shortage of vendors.
We have another question from Stephanie. Do you see LiDAR replacing ground surveys in the future? We also struggle with using large point data sets. Where can we go to improve our knowledge with using LiDAR data? So I guess really two questions.
Right.
One, do you see LiDAR replacing ground surveys in the future? And then the second one, looking for, educational material by the sounds of it.
Right. I don't know that we will ever replace the ground survey. For example, we have now that the NVA check. So we need a land surveyor to go out and do those NVA and the VBA checks. Enercan now for their RFPs, they actually require a signature from a, a surveyor who's a graduate of a school and has a stamp as part of their program. And then there are certain areas where the project is just going to be too small to send one of the big planes over, and also maybe too small to send a UAV out. UAVs can only fly if the weather is good. So you can't have super windy weather. You can't be flying UAVs over very busy roadways. You can possibly do a combination, but I think there's always going to be a need for ground surveyors. However, I know that there is also a shortage. So we go to the AOLS, the Association of Ontario Land Surveyors conference every year, and I can see the hair getting grayer and grayer over the years, and there aren't a lot of young folks coming into the survey profession. So there's always going to be a need. And what was the second question, Tim? Can you repeat that?
It was, we struggle with using large point clouds. Where can we go to improve our knowledge with using LiDAR data?
Right. So a good, come to us as the vendor. So if you procure a LiDAR data set and you're having difficulty working with it, we can disseminate the data. So you keep the full point cloud that has all of the important information that you need. But for example, we have clients, LiDAR contours are so ugly to look at. They're not those nice, smooth contours that folks are used to looking at. But once you disseminate those contours, they're not as accurate. So it's good to have, that data set that has all of the LiDAR information in it. And then your data can also be broken down so that it's easier to use day to day. But I would definitely reach out to the vendor who's acquired the data for you to help you with using the data.
And perhaps I would add, hire one of these new graduates from one of the accredited programs, whether it be in the
Absolutely.
West, BCIT, SATE, NATE, etc., or on the East, COGS, other
Mhm.
folks like that.
Yeah, Sir Sanford Fleming in Ontario.
Yes,
Yeah, yeah,
yes.
Seneca.
Another question, I think you've addressed it. Do you have acquisition federal standards like the USGS? And I mean, um, I think you made it quite clear that you were presenting both USGS standards and the Canadian standards, and I certainly appreciated the tables where you compared and contrasted the two. But maybe this question's going a little beyond what I'm thinking it is. So.
Yeah, so in Ontario, for example, the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry and OMAFRA, the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Affairs, they have two large airborne LiDAR acquisitions, and they use the QL0 as the spec to follow. But the QL0 was modified to meet the federal airborne LiDAR guidelines. And so the projects that we're delivering meet the federal airborne LiDAR guidelines, but in the RFP, it quoted QL0. So there's a merging of these two
Mhm.
specifications and standard. I think it's really exciting. Again, I've been exclusively working in LiDAR for 13 years before I was in photogrammetry. And when I first started, we were telling clients, oh, we think this is best for your project. We think this is best for your project based on our experience. But now there's an actual standard. And so that's really helpful. I don't know
Right.
if that answers your question.
I certainly think it does. Um,
Mhm.
we have one more here. What is the best point density in general that you would do to get point lidar to for hydrologic projects? Things like monitoring bank erosion, vegetation, and density.
Yeah, so I'm not gonna give you an answer on the best. It's always project specific. And again, if you take a look at the federal guidelines where it's talking about the different type of project, if you're looking at waterways that are going through urban areas, you're going to have to set your point density to best cover the urban setting that you're in. If you're looking at a LiDAR project that's in a rural area where there aren't urban features, then you're going to look at a different set of specifications. So you're always going to have to look at the project to decide what is going to be the best point density. And again, that's where you work with your vendor to help you decide
Yeah.
and
And
give you
I guess
options.
the other point we should probably mention, especially in a project like that, would be the temporal aspect of things.
That's right. Leaf
Especially
on versus leaf
hydrologic,
off.
yeah,
Mhm.
hydrologic projects. If you've got a lot of canopy close to the waterway, it's very tough for LiDAR to penetrate and actually get
Exactly.
to the water surface. But on the flip
Exactly.
side,
Yeah.
they were interested in vegetation cover, perhaps for
Mhm.
shading and so forth. So there's always choices to be made, isn't there? Uh,
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And I should say that both specifications outside of for forestry mapping are leaf off acquisition uh, for both specs.
yeah, I think that has a lot of implications, especially for flood risk mapping.
Hmm.
Um, a full summer acquisition, the shrubs are in full growth, dense grass cover, things like this,
That's right.
especially around floodplains, which um, we didn't really talk too much about, but LiDAR definitely is not going to penetrate right through all of that, depending on the density, is it?
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Leaf off is very important if you're looking at understory and you're wanting to get a good ground model.
Yes. Well, Susan, I don't see any other questions. Great job again. It was very nice listening to your presentation, and you handled the questions extremely well. And I'm sure you have a busy field season starting to stack up. So,
We do. Yes. We're already in the
yes.
air. Early this year. Very strange. Very early this year.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. No, things seem to have really bounced back after COVID in terms of even during COVID, I was hearing from LiDAR providers that they were busy all the way through it, and
Absolutely. Yeah, we
yeah.
had about a month or two where it was eerily quiet and then it just ballooned. So yeah, we've been very busy. Yeah. If folks have any questions, please feel free to reach out. My email address is on that slide. And thank you, Tim. And I guess I'll be seeing you in a couple hours at the panel.
I'm looking forward to it. Thank you, Susan.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you,
Okay.
everyone.